Is Donald Trump's Muslim ban a gift to ISIL? I'll ask the former FBI agent who helped lead the Bureau's hunt for Osama bin Laden. I'm Mehdi Hasan. Also on the show, is Vladimir Putin outplaying his adversaries both at home and abroad, or is he really just a weak leader trying to paper over the cracks of a crumbling economy and an isolated Russia? That's our debate. But first, President Trump's ban on visitors to the US from 7 Muslim-majority countries has sparked protests in cities across the world. Trump says he's trying to protect the US, but critics say he's just given a massive boost to ISIL's propaganda machine. So, has the Muslim ban made the threat worse? I'll ask the former FBI agent and counter-terrorism expert who helped lead the hunt for Al-Qaeda before and after 9/11. This week's headliner from London, Ali Soufan. Ali Soufan, thanks for joining me on UpFront. Donald Trump has banned people from 7 Muslim-majority countries from entering the United States, the so-called Muslim ban. He says he's doing it to protect US national security. His critics say it's a propaganda gift to groups like ISIL. Where do you stand on the Muslim ban and national security?
Blacklisting populations from 7 countries, majority countries in the Muslim world, does not help our national security interest, and it actually works directly into Al-Qaeda and the so-called Islamic State's propaganda. We have to be very careful on trying to create programs that will fire back on us down the road. We already have a robust vetting system for people who are coming to the United States. If you look since 9/11, for example, to include the 9/11 attack, we did not have citizens of these 7 countries participate in any major plot or major attack against the United States. And the reason it is very difficult for people from these 7 countries specifically and from many other countries to come to the United States if they are not vetted properly.
What about the argument from Trump administration officials that ISIL has specifically said in its public statements that it wants to use refugee movements, migrant movements, to get ISIL fighters into Europe, into the United States? So, of course, you have to focus on those refugee and migrant movements, say US officials.
Well, I think this is an easy statement to do, but it's very difficult to verify when you look at the reality. The situation in the United States is very different than Europe. Europe, you have the Schengen, you have people who arrive to the country on boats or, walking from one country to another. They can be resettled without being vetted properly. In the United States, it takes more than 2 years to vet an individual, and even after they are vetted and they come to the United States, they will go through additional security scrutinies before they come to the United States. So we have to be very careful on how we enhance the system. We have to tweak the system that's already in place. We have to put better emphasis on closing the gaps that already exist in the system. I'll give you an example, Mehdi. We have more than 40,000 foreign fighters from around 90 different countries that had joined the conflict zone in Iraq and Syria. We have 7,000 from Russia and the former Soviet republics. We have 5,000 from Europe. We have 6,000 from Tunisia. We have thousands and thousands of places like Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Morocco, and other places. So we have to figure out how can we prevent people who fought in the conflict zone, people who are battle-hardened, from coming back and creating havoc. We have to focus on behavior rather than just the blacklisting entire population in 7 countries that their citizens haven't been involved in any major terrorist attack in the United States since 2001, to include 9/11.
Some say that ISIL are celebrating this Muslim ban, this Trump policy. When I asked former CIA Director General Michael Hayden during the election campaign on this show, did he think Trump would end up being a recruiting sergeant for ISIL, Al-Qaeda and the rest, he said yes. Is that a view you share?
Yes, I agree. I agree with Director Hayden on this. And as you've seen recently, ISIS members and ISIS leaders, at least in their propaganda, have been calling President Trump and his ban and his recent policies a godsend. In the immediate aftermath, after the ban, a few groups in Syria, they were funded and trained by the CIA and by the U.S. government, joined allegiances, and they joined al-Nusra, which is al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria. Look, we have special troops on the ground, special forces on the ground, we have CT operatives on the ground, we have intel operatives on the ground in places like Yemen, in places like Libya, in places like Syria, in places like Iraq, and it is going to be very difficult for them to build relationship and work on existent relationship, develop existing relationships with people who support us, with people who fight with us, with people who bleed with us, if we actually paintbrush all their nationals as being terrorists and as being bad. We cannot win this war by dealing with our friends the same way we deal with our enemies.
Just on ISIL, how big a threat today does that group pose, specifically to the US mainland? Because Donald Trump and his supporters seem to suggest they're an existential threat to the US. The outgoing Obama administration claimed they'd been degraded and rolled back. Which is it?
Well, I don't believe ISIS is that kind of threat that's going to destroy America and destroy Western civilization. ISIS went from a terrorist organization to an insurgency to a proto-state, and now with all their bravado, we see them going back, a full cycle to an underground organization. Don't get me wrong, ISIS is going to be more dangerous as it dies. They're going to try to create havoc. They're going to try to do terrorist attacks. But we, in the United States, we went through a lot before, and we went through a lot with World War II, with the fight against communism, and a small little terrorist group from Raqqa is not going to make us change our way of life and change our value and change our principles because we fear someone is going to have a machine gun and shoot people in a club. This is disastrous every time it happens. We have to stand up, we have to protect our country, but we have to do it in sync with our principles, in sync with our values. We have been doing that.
Okay, but you say in sync with values, and this is not the right way to do things. Yet a lot of Americans who voted for Donald Trump, they hear him in his inauguration speech say that he's going to, quote unquote, eradicate radical Islamic terrorism from the face of the earth. And they say, yeah, that's what we need to do.
Well, that's good slogans when it happens, and a lot of people were hoping that Mr. Trump will change his rhetoric from campaigning to governing. And I think soon they will realize that just calling the threat Islamic extremist terrorism, that does not change the facts on the ground a bit. Actually, it might help groups like Al-Qaeda, groups like ISIS, who have been saying for years, it is a clash of civilization. It is the world against Islam. There is only two tents, the tent of the believers and the tent of the non-believers. And now we're proving that to them with the way we act.
And Trump now has people around him who believe that this is a clash of civilization. Steve Bannon, his chief strategist, has used very similar rhetoric. General Michael Flynn, his national security advisor, says fear of Muslims is rational. Mike Pompeo, his CIA chief, says radical Islam has infiltrated small towns across America. Are these guys helping or hurting the US with this kind of rhetoric?
I think this kind of rhetoric only hurt the U.S., and it hurts the U.S. because it isolates Muslim Americans who are in the United States. It makes them live under a shadow of suspicion, and that's going to help ISIS recruits, ISIS and Al-Qaeda and other extremist groups recruit in the United States.
If it's not security, if the ban is not about security, and you've made very clear you don't think it is, it doesn't improve security, then what's it all about? What's driving all of these moves on the part of the Trump administration, on the part of these senior officials? Why are they doing this?
It is very difficult. It's very difficult, Mehdi, to say it's about security when you have a ban that's not supposedly a ban, and then you have a change of policy that now the focus of counter-violent extremism only focus on Muslims and supposedly Muslim extremists, terrorists, whatever the term is. It's very difficult to say that there is not an anti-Muslim sentiment in these policies to cater to a specific base that they probably have in Washington.
Ali Soufan, thanks for joining me on UpFront. With North Korea on the one hand threatening to test launch bigger and bigger missiles, and President Donald Trump on the other tweeting that the United States should greatly strengthen and expand its nuclear capability, and later saying, let it be an arms race. Isn't it good to know that the other nuclear weapon states are trying to reduce their nuclear arsenals, setting a good example to both Trump and the rest of the world? Not quite. In fact, as of 2016, all 9 nations with nuclear weapons are either developing or deploying new weapon systems or have announced their intention to do so. Take France. Despite having reduced the overall size of its stockpiles of nukes, President Hollande has allocated a whopping 22 billion euros for the enhancement of its nuclear deterrent capabilities and has developed a new range of ballistic missiles carrying multiple warheads and offering longer range. How about the Brits? Still committed to spending billions on controversially upgrading and replacing their nuclear missile fleet Trident. When British Prime Minister Theresa May was asked if she was prepared to authorise a nuclear strike that could kill hundreds of thousands of men, women and children, she replied with one word.
Yes.
The voice of disarmament, eh? The Russians, meanwhile, are developing a new underwater drone designed to carry a thermonuclear weapon into foreign ports and recently completed nuclear war training with 40 million civilians. Remember, President Putin also threatened to use nuclear force over Crimea. As for China, forget upgrading. The Chinese are actually increasing the overall size of their nuclear arsenal, while China's underground Great Wall could hide as many as 3,000 nuclear weapons. So much for non-proliferation. And let's face it, Donald Trump's own predecessor wasn't that much better on nuclear weapons. Under Barack Obama, the US talked the talk.
I state clearly and with conviction America's commitment to seek the peace and security of a world without nuclear weapons.
But didn't walk the walk. Yes, he reduced the active stockpile of US nukes, but what about the $1 trillion that Obama devoted towards modernizing the US nuclear arsenal and the announcement on his watch of the first smart nuclear bomb, the most expensive of its kind ever built? So yes, be afraid when you read reports of how Trump once asked an advisor 3 times, why can't we use nuclear weapons? But also be aware of the enormous nuclear-sized hypocrisy exhibited by many of his critics, both at home and abroad. Is Vladimir Putin winning? The Russian president's annexation of Crimea looks pretty irreversible, with Ukrainian forces having failed to eject Russian forces from their territory. In Syria, the Russian air forces helped President Assad turn the tide in that civil war, retaking key cities from the rebels in the process. And then there's the US. New President Donald Trump heaped praise on Putin in the past. So, has the former KGB chief and chess fan outplayed and outmaneuvered his opponents at home and abroad? Joining me to debate this are Alexander Nekrasov, Russian journalist, commentator and former Kremlin advisor, and Ilya Ponomarov, former member of the Russian parliament, the Duma, strong critic of Vladimir Putin, who now lives in self-imposed exile in Ukraine. Thank you both for joining me in the arena. Ilya, let me start with you. From Syria to Ukraine to the EU to US domestic politics, it looks like Vladimir Putin has the upper hand on the international stage, strategically, militarily, geopolitically. Is that a fair assessment?
No, I think that's an exaggeration. He's a player, for sure, and he's a way stronger player than his opponents. He has a certain way to approach things, and he manifests himself very nicely. So by having all the propaganda tools at hand, like Russia Today, like different internet media, he made this appearance. But the question is whether Russian people are living better than they were previously. No. We are now enemies with our closest allies, Ukraine, with our brother nation of Ukrainians, with our closest relatives, and we are world pariah. So is this a win? I doubt.
Alexander Nekrasov, it's an exaggeration and propaganda to say Putin is doing well on the international stage right now.
Well, in my opinion, I think Putin is simply using the lack of any initiative on the part of the Western governments, on the part of the EU, and obviously the absolutely disastrous foreign policy of Obama. And that is why in Syria, for example, he simply used this situation to his benefit, and that's how it all developed. I don't really see any specific foreign policy which Putin pursues all over the world. And to say that he is winning, I'd rather say the West is losing than Putin is winning.
Just to deal with the elephant in the room, did Putin, in your view, want Donald Trump to win? Was a Donald Trump victory in November a victory for Vladimir Putin, in your opinion?
Well, obviously, in the Kremlin, they wanted a candidate who spoke of Russia well. Under Obama, it was an absolute disaster for Russia. I don't even understand, you know, when people are saying, well, the Kremlin wanted, Trump to win. Excuse me, why shouldn't it want Trump to win if Trump was saying good things about Russia, saying that we should change the policy? Are you telling me that they should have wanted Hillary to win, who was basically opposed to Russia, who was threatening Russia? So I don't understand this logic.
Do you think he wanted Trump to win?
I don't think so. I think that he actually wanted him to lose, but to lose on a narrow margin to sparkle a protest inside the United States. And I think that the strategy was to deal with Secretary Clinton because it was predictable, it was a known person. There is a long history of relations with Clinton, there is a long history of relations with her husband. There is a history of donations that were passed from Russia into Clinton Foundation. So it's a very convenient president to deal with. Right now, we have a totally unpredictable person in the White House which surrounded himself with hawkish people, and we don't know what they're going to do. Is this a scenario that any sensible leader would want?
But they're also talking about dropping sanctions on Russia. Which would upset all of America's Western allies, the EU, which has been trying to mount a united front in terms of sanctions.
Look, the sanctions, we should understand what they are. There is two parts of sanctions. There are so-called personal sanctions, which are put on individuals, and nobody is talking about dropping them. And there are sanctions which are put on the economy, on doing business with the country. And for example, my position from the very beginning was that economic sanctions, they are totally unnecessary and even harmful, because we are cutting actually the ties. Doing business with the West is actually the way to influence Russian society.
Alexander Nekrasov, there is this argument amongst some quote-unquote hawks in the West that now you have a President Trump who seems to be soft on Putin in some ways, that Putin will now feel emboldened, energized. If you're living in one of the Baltic republics, you might feel a little bit worried that Russian tanks are more likely to come across your border rather than less likely.
Well, first of all, nobody's going to attack the Baltics simply because they are members of NATO. So it would be madness for any leader of any country, by the way, not just Russia, to attack a member of NATO. So I don't even understand where this comes from.
Let me ask this question to Ilya. You wrote in 2015 that Russia in 2015 is like the Germany of 1933. That's over the top, isn't it? For all his sins, Vladimir Putin isn't Hitler and Russia today isn't Nazi Germany.
No, of course, Vladimir Putin is not Hitler. He is just a kleptocrat and not a bloody dictator as Hitler was. But in terms of what he is building inside the country, it reminds me very much of that period in Germany. And if you remember the history, when it all started in 1933, that was all about restoration of national economy, about modernization, about national dignity, and nobody was envisioning war. Even in 1939, the close members of Hitler's surrounding, they were not expecting the World War to emerge. And they were taken by surprise with the invasion into Poland and the scale of the problem.
When the Russians went into Crimea and annexed Crimea, you were the only MP, the only member of the Duma who voted against it. I think the vote was 445 to 1.
Yes.
What happened to you after that vote? How did you end up leaving Russia?
Well, then it was a criminal case opened against me, and it was done in the way when I was traveling internationally on the business of my home constituency in Siberia, whom I represent, and I needed to bring investments and technologies into. It was bridge construction. So
you believe you were targeted for voting against the government voting?
Yeah, of course. I was told directly that they will not allow me to come back and to repeat what I have done in future, because at that time it was discussion about the application of military force in Ukraine, and they didn't want anybody to stand openly against it inside the country.
And do you fear for your life now? You live in Kiev. I mean, do you not return because you're worried about being arrested or worried about something worse happening to you?
Well, look, unfortunately, we see examples of some of other members of Russian opposition being murdered and attacked and harassed and whatever. But, you know, that happens, and there is nothing I can do to protect myself against it.
Let me put that point to Alexander. Alexander, isn't it the case that Putin is only, quote unquote, doing well, a strong leader, because he's running an authoritarian state where he cracks down on dissent, cracks down on critics, cracks down on human rights groups? Isn't that the case?
First of all, I need to tell you this. Putin has to have a strong hand, because you can't run Russia being a weak leader. We have a big problem, just like in Ukraine, by the way. We have those groups of oligarchs who are trying to do whatever the hell they want, who are trying to influence politics, the economy, and so on. One of these oligarchs was Mikhail Khodorkovsky. He practically bought half of parliament and tried to even pull off a coup. So Putin has to be strong in order to keep the country together. So I don't understand
his own oligarchs in replacement.
This idea,
you know, right now the current oligarchs
this idea of
around
saying,
Putin are way stronger than the old oligarchs of 90s.
Alexander, he has his own oligarchs, Ilya.
The oligarchs, these groups, are fighting with each other. They're causing a lot of grief in the economy. They're causing a lot of grief that are still siphoning money out of Russia and so on. And by the way, if you, Ilya, want to see how oligarchs behave, look at Ukraine. Look what they're doing there. The same people who've been ripping off Ukraine, pillaging it, they're still there, they're still doing it, and Petr Poroshenko can't do anything about
Alexander,
it. Because he's not a strong
I'm very glad
leader.
that he actually brought it, because I think that the nature of regime in Ukraine, the social base of regime in Ukraine and the regime in Russia is exactly the same. It's a union between right-wing nationalists and neoliberals. Neoliberals who are running the economy and nationalists who is the base.
Ilya, does it undermine your credibility as a Putin critic that you chose to live in Ukraine? And so a lot of your fellow Russians, former colleagues, are saying, see, you're against our country.
The difference is very simple, that Ukrainians made a free choice of electing this power. And there is democracy in Ukraine.
And they didn't make a free choice in Russia.
And there is free media. There is nothing like that in Russia. It's very simple.
Let's be clear, Alexander, do you support democracy in Russia? Because you implied earlier that democracy is not the right thing for Russia.
No, excuse me. I'm always telling this to Western commentators and politicians. Russia is still in the transition stage. It had the most horrible dictatorship for more than 70 years. We've lost about 60 or 70 million people, some of the best, by the way, people. We had economy mismanaged on a scale unheard of in history. And you want this country to suddenly become all democratic, all nice, all wonderful.
That's actually exactly the point. Russia is transiting in the opposite direction. Ukraine is transiting in the right direction. Right now, in just last 2 years, Russia has lost 1.5 million people because they fled the country, because they don't want to stay. And that's the most economically active people, the most dynamic people, the most liberally thinking people.
Alexander, how successful is Putin really when his people are suffering in many ways? You talk about the economy. The Russian economy experienced no growth for 6 straight quarters. Real wages until very recently were falling. Poverty has been on the increase. Putin and his allies, the oligarchs, might be winning, but ordinary Russians aren't, are they?
Well, again, you know, I started to say this. Ordinary people are living badly in all countries of the world. Look at Greece, look at Portugal, look at Italy collapsing, look at Spain and so on.
When Putin was coming to power in the year 2000, he actually said that he wants to catch up on Portugal. Right now, he abandoned even this modest goal because it's not working. He cannot.
Alexander.
Ilya, all these GDP figures mean nothing. You know, it's absolutely useless to start
numbers.
Comparing those
facts.
GDP.
Or you're following this pattern of
they stand for nothing.
Facts. These are facts.
No, they stand for nothing.
Ilya, let me ask you this question. Isn't the problem for you that, yes, Russian people are suffering economically, yes, there's crackdown on human rights and dissent and public protests, etc., and yet even independent polling in Russia shows Putin is still very popular. He has the command of he commands the support of many, many Russians. Isn't that a problem for people like you?
No, of course it is a problem, but we should understand the source of this problem. And the source of this problem is very simple, because Putin is alone. because he does not allow anybody who can challenge him, not even like to run on the elections, but even to get access to media. That's why people simply don't know any of the alternatives.
You don't think it's because Russians like a strong leader, need a strong leader, as Alexander said earlier?
Of course, traditionally Russians like strong leader to be in power, and I have nothing against of strong leader to be in power. But strong doesn't mean corrupt. Strong doesn't mean dictator. Strong doesn't mean mean. Strong can be a good person, and it can be democratically elected, and it can be a people's man, not like it is today. Because right today we have a person represented by oligarchy. We have a person who represents siloviki. We have a person who represents bureaucracy.
Gentlemen, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you both for joining me in the arena. That's our show. Up Front will be back next week.